There is a woman in rural Ohio who cannot explain her own blood work. She has been tested 3 times by 3 separate labs over the course of 11 years. Each time the results come back flagged. Unusual markers, sequences that the technicians describe almost word for word using the same phrase. We've never seen this before. She has no rare disease, no known genetic disorder, no family history that accounts for it. She also reports being taken, repeatedly, by beings she cannot fully describe and cannot forget, and she is not alone. I want to start with something that sounds almost boring. A blood test, not a spacecraft, not a beam of light cutting through a bedroom ceiling at 3 a.m. Not the paralysis, the lost time, the figures standing at the foot of the bed. Just a blood test, a routine panel ordered by a general practitioner in a mid-sized American city, run through a standard laboratory and returned with a note that says, in clinical language, that something is anomalous. That's the word they use. Anomalous. I have read that word in 47 separate medical documents now, all connected in one way or another to individuals who describe repeated contact with extraterrestrial beings. 47. And I want to be clear, I did not go looking for this pattern. The pattern found me. It started in 2019 when I was researching something else entirely, a story about recovered memory therapy and its intersection with alien abduction claims from the 1980s and 1990s. I was skeptical. I remain in many ways skeptical. I was trained to follow evidence, not testimony. Testimony is slippery. People misremember. People confabulate. People want to have extraordinary experiences because ordinary life can be suffocating. But physical evidence is different. Physical evidence doesn't have an agenda. Physical evidence doesn't get hypnotized. Physical evidence doesn't read a book about alien abductions and then unconsciously reconstruct the narrative. Physical evidence just is, and it either fits the existing model or it doesn't. In this case after case after case, it doesn't. Let me tell you what I mean. The first documented cluster I encountered was assembled not by a UFO researcher or a fringe theorist, but by a retired hematologist working in Sao Paulo, Brazil, in the late 1990s. I'll call him Dr. M because he requested his full name not be used, a request I'll return to, had spent decades treating patients with blood disorders. He knew blood, he knew what normal looked like, what abnormal looked like, and crucially, what unprecedented looked like. In 1994, he began noticing something in a small subset of his patients, not a disease pattern, not a familiar mutation, something else, something that didn't fit into any existing diagnostic framework he'd encountered across 30 years of clinical practice. Several of his patients, unconnected to each other from different socio-economic backgrounds, different genetic ancestries, different regions of Brazil, were presenting with what he described in his private notes as chromosomal irregularities of unknown origin, variations in the expression of certain gene sequences, mitochondrial anomalies, and in at least 3 cases, what appeared to be additional genetic material that he could not account for. He ran the samples twice. He sent them to a colleague in Buenos Aires. Same results. The one thing these patients had in common, which he discovered only after conducting extended interviews, was this. Every single one of them reported multiple experiences of alien abduction. He was a scientist. He didn't believe in alien abductions. He said so plainly in the notes I was eventually able to access through a Brazilian researcher who had worked alongside him. But he believed in data, and the data was not resolving itself. Here is where the conventional explanation begins to fracture. We are told that alien abduction experiences are psychological phenomena, products of sleep paralysis, dissociative states, or suggestive therapy. And for many cases, that explanation may be sufficient. I'm not dismissing it. But psychological phenomena don't leave marks on chromosomes. They don't insert sequences into mitochondrial DNA. They don't produce laboratory findings that stump multiple independent professionals across 2 continents. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Move north to the United States. Bud Hopkins, the late artist and abduction researcher who worked out of New York City from the late 1970s through the 2000s, compiled testimony from hundreds of individuals describing repeated contact. What is less frequently discussed, what gets quietly omitted from the mainstream summaries of his work, is the physical evidence component of his research, the medical records, the scars, the implants, the blood anomalies. Hopkins was not a scientist, and his methodology has been criticized, sometimes fairly, but he was meticulous about documentation. He kept files, physical files. And those files, the ones that have survived and been made partially available to the researchers, contain medical records referencing unexplained anomalies in blood and tissue samples from individuals who had reported abduction experiences, repeatedly, not once, not twice, but in sequences, over years and sometimes decades. Why the sequences matter is something I'll return to. Move further. Go to the United Kingdom. 1983, the Pennine Hills of northern England. A woman named Page, she goes by Anne in the literature, Hapax, reports a series of contact experiences beginning in her adolescence and continuing into her late 30s. Her case is unusual not because of the experiential detail, though the detail is extensive, but because she agreed to undergo comprehensive medical evaluation at two separate institutions. The first evaluation, conducted in 1986, finds nothing. The second, conducted in 1993, after she reports a third distinct abduction experience, finds something. Chromosomal material that the examining physician describes as, and I'm paraphrasing from a secondary account here, structurally inconsistent with any known human variant, not a disease, not a mutation the physician can name, something that isn't in the reference books. She does not change between these two evaluations. She has no illness, no radiation exposure, no environmental contamination that anyone can identify. She has, by her account, been taken again. And then there is Japan. The 1980s and early 1990s saw a significant wave of what Japanese researchers called Uchujin Sogu, extraterrestrial encounters, reported across rural prefectures, particularly in Nagano and Akita. Several of these reports involved individuals who described repeated contact over multiple years. A small number of these individuals were examined medically, and the documentation, partial, frustratingly incomplete, but not entirely absent, suggests a pattern, consistent with what I've found elsewhere. Unusual markers, unexplained changes in blood composition, things that arrived without medical explanation and refused to leave with one. Not in Ohio, not in Brazil, not in northern England, in Japan. And here is where it becomes impossible to ignore. These individuals were not in communication with each other. They were separated by language, culture, geography, and time. They had no shared framework for interpreting their experiences, no common researcher guiding their narratives toward a predetermined conclusion. And yet, the physical evidence, where it exists, rhymes. It doesn't just rhyme. It nearly repeats. Let me be precise about what I mean by physical evidence, because I think the casual inclusion of this phrase in abduction literature has diluted its significance. I'm not talking about people who claim to feel different. I'm not talking about psychological after effects, the anxiety, the hypervigilance, the fractured sleep. Those are real, and they matter, but they are explicable within conventional frameworks. I'm talking about measurable, documentable physical changes. The most frequently reported category, and when I say frequently, I mean across independent accounts that span decades and continents, involves what researchers have broadly categorized as alterations in white blood cell composition. Not pathological alterations, not cancer, not autoimmune disorder, not infection. Something more subtle and in some ways more disturbing. Elevated concentrations of particular lymphocyte subtypes that don't correspond to any active immune challenge. The body is mobilized. It is responding. But to what? The second category involves what appear to be structural anomalies at the chromosomal level. telomere irregularities most commonly. Telomeres, for those unfamiliar, are the protective caps at the end of chromosomal strands. They shorten with age and cellular stress, and their length is considered a reliable proxy for biological aging. In a number of abductees reporting multiple contact experiences, telomere analysis reveals something that does not align with their chronological age or their documented lifestyle factors. Sometimes they appear younger than expected, sometimes older, and in a small number of cases, small but not negligible, individual chromosomes display structural features that the examining geneticists cannot categorize in the 21st century, with the full apparatus of modern genomic science available. The third and perhaps most contentious category involves what some researchers cautiously refer to as non-human sequences, genetic material that does not map cleanly to Homo sapiens reference genomes. I want to be careful here because this is precisely the area where extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence, while suggestive, is incomplete. Some of these anomalous sequences may represent known but rare variants. Some may represent sequencing artifacts, but some, and the researchers who have examined them most closely are reluctant to go on record, which itself is telling, appear to be genuinely novel. Novel, as in not previously documented in the human genome. The deeper I went into this material, the harder it became to maintain comfortable distance, because I kept finding the same thing, arriving from different directions. Single contact experiences showed some anomalies, multiple contact experiences showed more, and the pattern between first, second and third reported contacts suggests something cumulative, something that builds, as though whatever process is occurring is not finished after one encounter, as though it requires repetition. In 1994, a researcher at a small university in the American Southwest, whose name I will omit as they are still professionally active and specifically requested anonymity, compiled what they called a biological concordance of physical evidence across 63 abduction cases. The document was never published. It was circulated privately among a small network of researchers in the mid-1990s, and according to the people I've spoken to who saw it, was extraordinary in its rigor and its implications. I have not been able to obtain this document. I have spoken to 4 people who have read it. Their accounts of its contents are consistent. They describe a systematic analysis of blood samples, tissue samples, and medical records from experiences across the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia. They describe finding that, in the words of one source, should have ended the debate about whether something physical is happening to these people. But it wasn't published. The researcher left academia. The document, as far as anyone can tell, has not resurfaced. The silence around it is deafening. This is not an isolated occurrence. The history of serious scientific engagement with the physical dimensions of alien abduction is a history of stopped research, retired researchers, and disappeared documents. Dr. John Mack of Harvard Medical School, whose credentials cannot be dismissed, spent years interviewing abductees and documenting their experiences. His research generated controversy, institutional pressure, and eventually an unprecedented attempt by Harvard to formally review his work and, some argue, to neutralize it. He was ultimately cleared, but the pressure was real and the signal it sent to other academics was unmistakable. Don't go here. Don't look at this. The result is a remarkable scarcity of peer-reviewed literature on the physical dimensions of abduction experiences, not because researchers have examined the evidence and found nothing, but because examining the evidence at all carries professional consequences that most people are rationally unwilling to accept. What we are told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, is that this is not a legitimate area of scientific inquiry. What the evidence suggests is that someone or something wants it to stay that way. I'm not going to name a group. I'm not going to point at an institution and say they are suppressing this. I don't know that. I can't prove that. What I can say is that the pattern of suppression, the stopped careers, the lost documents, the withdrawn funding, is itself a pattern. And patterns, in my experience, are rarely accidental. The missing records are as meaningful as the ones that survive. I want to pause here and address the hypothesis directly, because I think dancing around it at this point would be intellectually dishonest. The proposition that extraterrestrial beings are interacting with human beings, and that these interactions produce measurable changes in human genetic material, is an extraordinary claim. I know that. I've known it from the beginning of this inquiry, and I held it at arm's length for as long as I could, because the alternative explanations, sleep paralysis, psychological suggestion, recovered memory artifacts, wishful thinking, deliberate hoax, are all available, and all in individual cases potentially adequate. But there's a problem. No conventional explanation accounts for the physical evidence. Not sleep paralysis, not suggestion, not hoax. None of these mechanisms produces chromosomal alterations. None of them inserts novel genetic sequences into a person's DNA. None of them causes the immune system to behave as though it has encountered something for which it has no existing response protocol. And none of them explains why the physical changes are cumulative across multiple reported contact events. That last point is critical. If abduction experiences were purely psychological, purely internal, we would expect no consistent relationship between the number of reported contacts and the degree of physical anomaly. We might expect psychological intensity to correlate with something, but not chromosomal change. The body should be unaffected. The body is not unaffected. When multiple experiences examined independently by different physicians in different countries across different decades show a progressive accumulation of biological anomalies that correlates with the number of reported contact events, the psychological explanation doesn't just bend under the weight of the evidence, it breaks. So what does account for it? The extraterrestrial hypothesis that non-human intelligent beings are conducting some form of biological interaction with certain human individuals over extended periods for purposes we have not yet determined is the hypothesis that fits the evidence with the least strain. I don't say that comfortably. I say it because when I align the evidence against the available explanations, it's where the arrow points, multiple beings operating across multiple continents, working with individual humans across years and decades, not randomly, not haphazardly, selectively, repeatedly, and with what can only be described as purpose. What is the purpose? That is the question I cannot answer. That may be the question no one currently alive can answer. Beyond the biological, there is a broader category of physical evidence associated with repeated abduction cases that I have not yet addressed. The implants. I use that word because it's the word used in the literature and because no better word has emerged. Small objects recovered from beneath the skin of experiencers, often from locations the individual cannot explain and did not choose, behind the ear, in the nasal cavity, embedded near the knee. Objects that, when subjected to materials analysis, have produced results ranging from unremarkable terrestrial composition to something considerably more interesting. The work of Dr. Roger Lear, a podiatric surgeon who removed and analysed alleged implants from multiple subjects before his death in 2014, is the most documented example of systematic physical analysis in this area. His methodology was criticised and some of his conclusions have been disputed, but the objects themselves, some of which were subjected to analysis at institutions including Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I encourage anyone reading this to look up those reports directly, were not dismissed. They were described as unusual, as exhibiting properties that were difficult to explain, as composed in some cases of isotopic ratios that don't correspond to naturally occurring terrestrial materials. Isotopic ratios. This is not the language of wishful thinking or confabulated memory. This is the language of mass spectrometry. The extraterrestrials, if that's what they are, appear to be leaving something behind, not just in the genetic material of the individuals they interact with, but physically, in their bodies. Objects that serve an unknown function. Objects that, in some cases, are removed only after years of inexplicable symptoms. Objects that, when removed, sometimes cause the very anomalies I've been describing. The immune irregularities, the cellular disruptions to partially resolve, as though removing the device interrupts a process that was ongoing. And here's the strangest part. In individuals who report abduction experiences, both before and after implant removal, the biological anomalies return if the contact experiences continue. The body changes again. The markers reappear. Whatever is being done to these individuals does not require the physical object to be present. The object may be a tool, the object may be a marker, but the process, whatever the process is, continues regardless. That raises a straightforward but deeply uncomfortable question. What is the objective? What are the extraterrestrials building toward across years and decades of repeated contact with the same individuals, making incremental changes to human DNA that no human scientist has yet been able to fully characterize? I don't have the answer. I'm not sure the answer is available to me, or to anyone operating within the frameworks we currently possess. Here is the thing that finally broke through my skepticism. Not the individual cases, not the biological anomalies, not the implants or the missing documents or the silenced researchers. The coordination problem. If alien abduction experiences were purely cultural artifacts, stories people told because they had absorbed the imagery from science fiction films and television, we would expect them to be culturally specific. American abductions would look American. Japanese abductions would look Japanese. Brazilian abductions would look Brazilian, with local mythological flavoring and culturally specific imagery. But they don't. The phenomenology of multiple contact abduction experiences is strikingly consistent across cultures that have had minimal cross-contamination. The procedural elements, the paralysis, the examination table, the instruments, the focus on biological material including blood, tissue and reproductive samples, the beings with enlarged eyes and attenuated limbs, and above all, the repeated return to the same individual, appear in accounts from indigenous communities in the Amazon, from rural Japanese communities in the 1970s, before widespread Western media penetration, from rural Australians, from South Africans, from Scandinavians, from communities that had no meaningful cultural connection to the American abduction narrative that emerged publicly with Betty and Barney Hill in 1961. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The same elements, the same procedures, the same focus on the body and specifically on biological material. Once you see the global uniformity, you cannot stop seeing it. The conventional explanation for this is cultural diffusion, that the American abduction narrative spread globally through media and was unconsciously adopted by people seeking a framework for unusual experiences. And that explanation has merit for cases from the 1980s onward, when American popular culture had become truly global. But it doesn't explain the pre-1960 accounts, the accounts from isolated communities, the accounts from individuals who, when researchers verified their media exposure, had genuinely not encountered the American abduction narrative before describing their experiences in nearly identical terms. It doesn't explain a Shipibo shaman in the Peruvian Amazon describing, in 1971, an encounter that maps almost exactly onto accounts being given simultaneously by rural Minnesotans who had never heard of the Amazon. Not similar, not resonant, nearly identical. The coordination problem, as I've come to think of it, is this. If the abduction experience is internally generated, a product of the human mind, how did isolated human minds across every continent in the mid-20th century independently arrive at the same highly specific scenario? The same beings, the same procedures, the same focus on genetic material, the same pattern of return. The odds of independent convergence on a scenario this specific are not just low, they appear at a certain point to be mathematically indefensible. Which leaves the alternative. The scenario isn't internally generated. The scenario is real, or real enough that something external is imposing it, consistently, globally, across cultural and geographic boundaries that no human institution could navigate with this degree of precision. Something is doing this everywhere, to many people, over many years, and it is not random. The evidence strongly suggests that certain individuals are selected and returned to. Not everyone who reports an abduction experience reports multiple experiences, but a significant subset does, and this is the subset that produces the most pronounced biological anomalies, the repeat encounters, the accumulating changes. Why those individuals? What is the selection criterion? What quality or characteristic marks a person for repeated biological interaction by whatever intelligence is conducting these operations? I don't know. No one I've spoken to knows. But the fact that there is a selection criterion, that the interactions are not random, implies an intelligence capable of identifying specific humans, tracking them across time, and returning to them for ongoing biological purposes. The scope of that implication is not small. There is a dimension to this inquiry that I haven't yet addressed, and I want to address it now because I think it's being missed in most discussions of abduction phenomena, even the serious ones. We may be watching a biological process in real time that we are almost completely failing to document. If extraterrestrial beings are interacting with human genetics not randomly but selectively and repeatedly, with purpose and apparent design, then the changes being introduced into certain human genomes may represent information. Data, not random damage, not the cellular equivalent of noise, something deliberate. What if the anomalous sequences being found in the genomes of repeat experiences are not errors? What if they're insertions? What if something is being written into human DNA, across decades, across generations, across the bodies of thousands of individuals worldwide who have no idea what they are carrying? I can't answer that question. It may not be answerable with current technology or current frameworks, but here is what I find most haunting. We are not really trying to answer it. The research that could begin to address this question, coerce systematic, rigorous genomic analysis of individuals with verified histories of multiple contact experiences, is not being funded. It is not being conducted by institutions with the resources to do it properly. The researchers who have come closest to it have been discouraged, professionally marginalized, or simply unable to secure the support necessary to do the work at the scale it requires. The inquiry is being abandoned before it has truly begun, and in the meantime the people who carry these anomalies in their blood and their chromosomes are being told when they seek medical answers that their results are unusual but not actionable, that there's nothing to be done, that the anomalies are not diagnostic of any known condition and therefore fall outside the clinical framework's ability to engage with them. Not X, not Y, not Z, but something else entirely, and therefore invisible to the system designed to identify and respond to precisely this kind of biological disruption. The knowledge that might be contained in those sequences, knowledge about human biology, about genetics, about what the human body is capable of becoming, may be sitting unread in the cells of thousands of people worldwide, accumulating slowly with each reported contact event, waiting for someone with the tools and the courage to look at it seriously. I began this inquiry skeptical. I want to be honest about where I am now. I am not a believer in the religious sense of the word. I have not been converted to a fixed position. I hold my conclusions loosely, and I am aware of the ways my own desire to find something meaningful could be shaping what I see in the evidence. But I am also a researcher who follows evidence, and the evidence has taken me somewhere I didn't expect to go. The physical changes in the bodies of repeat experiencers are real. The global consistency of the abduction experience is real. The missing documents and silenced researchers are real. The implants and their anomalous materials analyses are real. The progressive accumulation of biological anomalies correlated with multiple contact events is real, and the silence, the profound institutional deliberate silence around serious investigation of these phenomena, is perhaps the most real thing of all. I keep returning to a single question, or rather to the space where an answer should be. If something is modifying human DNA repeatedly, selectively, globally, across generations, what does the finished product look like? Are we watching the early stages of something, a project in progress, an experiment whose conclusion we haven't yet lived long enough to see? What does the woman in Ohio carry in her blood that the laboratory can flag but not identify? What was written into her genome during the encounter she can't entirely remember and can't entirely forget? And if the same thing is being written into thousands of bodies worldwide, across decades of unreported and under-investigated contact events, what accumulates in the human species as a whole? What are we becoming? What have we already become? The official explanations run out here. The clinical frameworks go quiet. The research trails end in abrupt professional silence, and the documents that might answer these questions are missing or locked or simply gone. All that remains are the patterns, the bodies, the anomalies that shouldn't be there, and the question that keeps opening wider the harder I try to close it. What if the experiment isn't over? What if it never stopped?